Now, our next speaker is great at metrics. Metrics, I hear you say. Metrics. What metrics? Is that really so interesting? Well, what if I told you that metrics could bring you Earth Overshoot Day? Has anyone ever heard of Earth Overshoot Day? Yeah? Okay, you know roughly what we're talking about. Well, that's a metric-based thing, Earth Overshoot Day. And it just so happens that we are joined by Mathis Wackernagel. I made that. I did practice that. Mathis Wackernagel, co-founder and president of the Global Footprint Network, which is behind Earth Overshoot Day. So, Mathis, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful to see people now in real life after many years of just screens. And the impeccable organizational skills of Jane and her team is just amazing. A topic that I'm not super familiar with, but it was riveting all morning, and so I'm glad we are here together. So I will talk about the bigger theme, overshoot, and you will ask yourself legitimately, what has nanograms to do with gigatons? Because I will be talking about gigatons to a large extent. And you may have heard about the butterfly effect. And I just want to tell you the butterfly effect is a huge exaggeration. Because if you look, for example, at COVID, with a friend we tried to calculate what's the weight of all the COVID viruses, and it doesn't even add up to the weight of a butterfly wing. That's why it's an exaggeration. So even smaller amounts can have huge effects, as we have seen. And in reality, if you look at the human history of the last 200 years, what we call success to a large extent is that we humans have been able to overpower or cancel corrective feedback. Like corrective feedback of early death, which is not that nice. We have corrected with better tubes in the ground. Like cities are now more sanitized than 200 years ago, and so we live longer lives, etc. So there's a lot of corrective feedback that we overpower, but in the end, we're just getting bigger and bigger. So the enabling factors of the small things can actually have huge, mega impact. A second point why I'm here as well is, what does this big thing have to do with food? Actually, food and plastics are very tightly interlinked. Overall, we're in a project on food. We call it Food for Future, thanks to Greta Thunberg. And we started by identifying what we call, bit tongue-in-cheek, 10 impossible imperatives. What are the 10 things that need to happen that we can feed ourselves in the long run? And it is a bit like, and truly, we now think at this point they're still impossible and they're necessary. That's why they're imperatives as well. And plastics shows up in some of them, because plastics is not just the end coat of like the plastic spoon, you know that, but it's kind of the whole production in agriculture, transport of food, and then distribution, storage, etc. And we have no idea how we can maintain these huge mass flows of food without the use of plastics at this point. And that's just one part of the 10 imperatives. So go there, footprintnetwork.org, 10 imperatives, entertain yourselves with that. The next point I also want to say is perhaps the most important one for me from a professional perspective. I wish I had known that earlier. I only realized late in life. I'm turning 60 this year, so it's kind of a bit late in life to realize. I'll tell you now. So it's that actually what I realize is information is useless. Unless it's empowering. That's if you want to change the world. Actually, information that is relevant only, or let's take a step back. Information it's better if it's actually truth-based, because somehow you'll find out. So that's a good condition. I'm also not arguing against that part. It's just not sufficient. It's useful also if it's relevant. Because, how interesting volcanoes, but there are no volcanoes here, it's not relevant, so it doesn't affect. But actually, if it's only relevant but not empowering, it may be counterproductive. Because if people don't want it, they will use all their intelligence to find out excuses. And I will give you an example. In Switzerland, it's state doctrine that burning waste is carbon-free because it's very convenient. But actually, the carbon intensity of waste, Swiss high-quality waste, so to say, even, is much lower than even the worst coal. We'd be better off putting that waste into the ground and burning bad coal. But Switzerland has had a state doctrine that it's carbon-free somehow. And so we build distribution networks for warm water, etc. So we are so much built into that system that it's relevant to say that it's not CO2 neutral in reality. It's relevant, but it's not so empowering for the Swiss. It's very hard to hear. They said about the oil industry before, they said, if your salary depends on not understanding, it's very hard to understand. And that applies very widely, I realized. And I think that's also the big tragedy in the climate debate, which probably also was propagated strongly by Al Gore through the movie Inconvenient Truth, that this kind of summarizes to a large extent how many think climate change is an inconvenient truth. You know? That's kind of I think the main narrative, the inconvenient truth. What does inconvenient truth mean? It means the more you know, the worse you're off. The more you know, the more you have to give up your precious life for this anonymous humanity. And then people have beautiful speeches about it, and very little happens. And even at the UN level, I'm getting on my soapbox. My wife always tells me, get off the soapbox, but now you invited me for the soapbox. This is a big soapbox here. Even in the UN, what do they invite nations to do? They call it nationally determined contributions. How wonderfully philanthropic does Switzerland want to be for the world to reduce its own CO2 emissions? And the Swiss say a little bit maybe, but not too much, you know, overall, once they're honest after a few beers. You know? So, of course, on the stage, they say, no, we have to do things. Anyhow, so that's, I think, what I want to see, that is it really the inconvenient truth? And that's, I think, the only message, not so much about metric, but there will be some numbers. And this is actually really the point, is to say, really, the future has never been more predictable than today. What do we know about the future? We know people will want to eat, they will want to sleep, they will want to be housed safely, they want to move about. We know that, and we actually always knew that. What we also know is that in any or every imaginable scenario, there will be more climate change and more resource constraints. The combination of it may be changing a bit, like you can have more fossil fuel use and more climate change, or less fossil fuel use and less climate change, and then also a bit more biological resources. You know, you can choose a little bit, but overall, more climate change and more resource constraints. So what's the benefit of not preparing yourself for that? Given that the future is coming more quickly towards us than we can adjust our infrastructure. What's the benefit of going to a conference, like there's a storm coming, you're in a boat, and there's a big storm coming, you sit on that boat and say, oh, what should I do? Should I fix my boat, or should I go to a conference of boat builders where we decide which boat should be fixed first? Then we can point fingers at them because they haven't fixed their boat yet. I don't know if there's a parallel to something else I wanted to... Anyhow, you get the point? So we are in a new world where the rules are shifting, whether we like it or not, because we have become the dominant force. Some people call it the Anthropocene. The underlying phenomenon is overshoot. The idea, which is now not only an idea, but the practice of humanity, that we can use more than what Earth can renew. That actually the renewal capacity, the regeneration of the planet, is the physically most limiting factor. So people say, we might want to get to a regenerative economy. Actually, that's the only possibility. The only question is how quickly. If we don't go there quickly, much of the regeneration will be lost in the meantime. So regeneration, that's the only future possible. We call it sometimes one planet prosperity. Do you want one planet prosperity? Or you can have, people think the alternative is two planet prosperity. No, that's not the alternative. It's one planet prosperity or one planet misery. It's not so difficult to choose. You know, we could have a poll. Which one do you want? Anyhow, so how do we know whether we are overshoot? Actually, it's measurable. We use about 15,000 data points per country and year using UN data, not because they are the best, because they are the most widely accepted, to look at that and say, okay, high school math, How much do we have? How much area is productive? In the world, how many people are we? So we have about 1.5 hectares of ecologically productive space. We standardize it to make it of equal productivity. That's why we call them global hectares, but it's 1.5 hectares of ecologically productive space exists on the planet, and then we can compare it. What does it take to produce all your orange juice, and if you drink milk or oat milk, also takes space, or cotton or silk, and absorbing your CO2, rubber for your tires, for your bicycle tires, etc. All take space, and that adds up to about 2.7 hectares per person. How is it possible to use more than what you have? It's like with money. You can spend more. In Switzerland, it's not possible. But in other countries, they can spend more than what they earn for some time, they say. Anyhow, that's what we do with our resources as well. So another way of saying it, it's like using 1 3/4 Earth, which is not possible because we only have one. But it's possible because it's the regeneration of the planet that we use too fast. So if we express it in time, you can say between January 1st and this year, 28th of July, humanity has used as much as Earth can renew in the entire year. So I won't do it here, but at the end I will give you, actually, if you go to footprintnetwork.org/tools, and I will give that at the end again, you can get to all these tools. You can go to a map. Also look at it for every country. We're just talking about the Netherlands today. Like, talking about food, the Netherlands, according to the state of the Netherlands, the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, says we are the 3rd largest exporter in the world of agricultural products. Now I would like to see a guess. How many Netherlands does it take to support just Dutch food consumption in the Netherlands? How many Netherlands does it take? Yeah, actually only 2. Even though they're the largest exporter, it takes 2 Netherlands just to feed them, and another 5 for all the rest. So it takes about 7 Netherlands to support the Netherlands. How is it possible that they can be the 3rd largest agricultural exporters? Because they're also massive, probably the primary agricultural importer to feed their pigs, for example, and the CO2 emissions associated with agriculture. Switzerland only uses 4.5 Switzerlands. You can actually go further and say, yes, Switzerland has a lot of money, we can buy stuff. But worldwide, if you look at a double challenge, how many people live in countries that have less regeneration than what they consume themselves, which is not possible forever, and also less than world average income, which means in the global resource market, they have a hard time buying the shirt off the other people's back. On average, that's what money does. If you have less money than others, it's kind of harder to get more from them than they get from you. So the answer is 72% in that quadrant have this double challenge. 72% live in a country with ecological deficit and have less than world average income today. So you can say probably none of you lives in that country, or some of you may, very few of you. But this is a mega trend that's globally so widespread, you cannot escape from it. You can also look, and I won't go into that tool, you can play with it yourself, look at what does that mean for the longer run. So what are the parameters that shift, overshoot in the long run? It's on the consumption side, like on the production side, how healthy is the planet? So that's the green line. And then the red line, how many people are we and how much do we consume per person? Then you can see how that develops. And what the important information here is, that may not be empowering but relevant, is that it's not just overshoot that produces damage, it's the accumulation of overshoot that produces an ecological debt. So it's the area under the curve between the green and the red line. So far we had about 20 years of production of the planet that is equivalent to the debt if it was reversible. And then you can look at, like, if it continued like this, we would be at 100 planet years of debt. That's 5 times more than today. That has the impact. So it shows it's not just kind of overshoot itself, but it's the accumulation, the persistence. And that's the same with the persistence of chemicals. In some ways, that's kind of the persistence problem. So if you look at that, the question is for you, the entrepreneurs in you as entrepreneurs, what does it mean for you? And I think it becomes a very simple insight in some ways that I hope is empowering. That's what I hope is empowering. We only learned like in the last 2 years how to make it empowering. I knew how it was relevant for companies, but in a way that they invented a lot of excuses. Yeah. So it's pretty simple. Which companies will be more valuable or even valuable in this future of climate change and resource constraints? Obviously, those that, if they expand, global overshoot goes down. Make sense? You make the company bigger and overshoot goes down. They will not run into constraints. They will actually profit as constraints hit us. For example, a car company, you expand it, they make more cars, global overshoot goes up. So that's not an example. But windmill companies, for example, you produce windmills, it takes energy, but then these windmills displace coal power, and then overshoot goes down. Make sense? We even took it a step further. We worked with a big recycling company, $1 billion company. You cannot buy their stocks because they're family owned. So sorry about that. But what we did is we said, how much does it take on average to produce €1, dollar, pound, or Swiss franc? Now I can say all the four at the same time. Value add. How much does that take? It takes on average about 2.5 square meters of ecologically productive space to produce the metabolism to make that happen, on average, worldwide. This company, with every dollar value add they produce, they save resources, and Earth overshoot goes down tenfold compared to the average dollar. Tenfold in the right direction. So that's an example of such a company. So that's what we call circular economies. Circular economy is one that, if you expand it, overshoot goes down. It's pretty simple. If you're an investor, where would you want to invest? In companies that are losing relevance? It's your choice. Anyhow, I think the point is made. How is it possible? Again, if you go to Footprint Network/tools, you will find that as well. We put together what we call Power of Possibility, of all kinds of ways how you can reduce your demand on nature while being economically viable. What's possible? And we categorize them in 5 simple ways. Just because the hand has 5 fingers, it's easier to remember. So the thumb represents regeneration. Can we have a healthy planet? Ecosystems work, and there are opportunities with regenerative agriculture, shade-grown coffee, and all kinds of ways how we can strengthen ecosystem services and productivity while also being active in that field. Demand is shaped by 4 factors that are overlapping. So how do we live on this planet? How is that shaped, particularly by urban infrastructure? The way I consume and live is more influenced by the city I live in than by my mother, even at my age. The second one is, how do we power these cities and infrastructures? Do we use solar power? Do we use wind power? Do we use coal power? Makes a big difference. How do we eat? Currently, food occupies over 55% of the planet's biocapacity. Just to feed ourselves. 55%. And some don't have enough food. And then the last one is a more slow-moving one. How many are we? As we are double as many people, obviously there's only half as much planet per person. So also from a perspective, it's a slow-moving one that also has many social benefits we could go into. But these are the key factors that determine the fate of humanity, but also show the opportunities where business innovation is needed. And policy innovation. You can apply the same idea for infrastructure investment of cities. By investing that money of the Zurich budget, is Zurich's dependence on resourcing going up or down? Fast enough. So it's same idea. So that's the idea of metrics. Metrics are useless unless they're empowering. How do they help people to kind of do what they want to do? So it doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about things that we don't see as empowering immediately. But I think if you want to make them transformative, it's good to take a step back and think, how do we tell the story so it does become empowering? That's the main idea. And the other thing I wanted to say, the future is in your hand, literally. Think about your hand, look at it, full of opportunities. It's a hands-on experience. And it's a big drive to 2100. There are people now alive that will be alive in 2100. It's not that far away. And we can help them to make it and can help us to make it. It's possible. Thank you. And thank you for having us here.